Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Givanch, and welcome to What's Wrong With the podcast. Today, I have the great pleasure of chatting with Dr. Lauri Goldkind. Lauri is a professor at Fordham's Graduate School of Social Service and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Technology and Human Services. Her current research has two strands: data justice and artificial intelligence in human services and nonprofits, and artificial intelligence in social work practice. She has a robust network of community partners in New York City and internationally, including the International Federation of Settlement Houses, United Neighborhood Houses, and Caritas Macau. She holds an M.S.W. from SUNY Stony Brook with a concentration in planning, administration, and research, and a PhD from Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Dr. Lauri Goldkind, and Lauri is a professor of social work at Fordham University. Lauri, welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So, for our audience today, can you please tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to where you are today?
For sure. So I have been an academic now for, I don't remember, 16 or 17 years. I am a professor of social work at the Graduate School of Social Service at Fordham University. I am also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Technology and Human Services. So I've been doing this for a while. In my field, people are encouraged to have like like a practice experience or to be in practice before you transition into academia. Before I was an academic, I was in mostly in New York City in youth services and nonprofits, working with young people. And so a lot of that work has informed how I think about the research that I have done and been doing today. And that work was about program development, some coaching of New York City public school principals, data management. Before there was DataViz and Tableau, there was a Microsoft product called Microsoft Access, and it was the
Mhm.
workhorse of the nonprofit sector. I suspect that some of my nonprofit colleagues are still using Access and Excel to manage and wrangle their data. And, before there was sort of fancy ways of data storytelling, there was really just bar charts and pie charts, pie graphs. And so that was kind of a large part of my work in whatever I was doing sort of officially. I also spent a lot of
Mm.
time with data and thinking about sort of as a sector, how do we kind of leverage the things that we have access to? And in that world, and this sort of also comes into social work, there is very limited infrastructure and tech resources, both for hardware like systems things, so servers, machines, cloud storage, all those components, but also the professional development resources to have staff be able to vision sort of what tech could do. And so that has always been of interest to me. And I have brought that thread into my research life. And then I guess in 2022, when Gen AI was sort of exploded, turned hard left into AI in the nonprofit world, and also kind of thinking about how do we cross-train students so that when they
Mm.
go out into real life, they both have some level of digital competence, and as well as some empathy, right, towards the persons who these products will kind of be worked on, right, or unleashed on. And so that's kind of my sensibility and arc over the last, maybe since I've been an academic, over the last 15, 16 years. And I'm very interested in how do we help students to understand this very interdisciplinary and interconnected workplace that they're going to go into, when we're very discipline siloed in like academia.
I love that your kind of insight from practice, like not seeing tech support or how does tech show up? How do we use data? Is there enough consideration around that? Is there enough capacity and capability within nonprofits? Like, I love that you've carried on that insight so that you started doing research in kind of tech slash social work slash nonprofit space. But also, I think to your point, the 2022 explosion kind of showed us the urgency in that, right? Like maybe well, we knew that was always a problem, but now the urgency is that the gap could get massive if we don't
Yeah,
address it.
no, I think that has that disruptive is really trite, but the
Yeah,
disruption of the unveiling of that kind of technology, that I think that being able to ask a plain English, plain language, no code question to a large language model that is an AI tool made
yeah.
very plain, right? It's a very concrete example of the potentials of what these pieces could do. And then I think the other thing that has really been an accelerant for my sector is the pandemic, right? Because, we spent three,
Sure.
before the pandemic, there was a lot of service delivery in and around mental health. The VA was a very early adopter of remote psychotherapy, right? So delivering
Mm.
therapy via video
Yeah, yeah,
conference
yeah.
because they needed to, because of the shortage of providers. But the pandemic really made plain that a lot of the things and activities that our folks engage in, therapy, case management, even just support and like having a space to convene people, it can be done online. And so I think
Mm.
both of those things have sort of led to maybe more understanding and appreciation that, hey, we might have some catching up to do.
Mm. Oh my God, yeah. And it came so back to back too, 2020, 2022, when suddenly like the exponential need, right, growing.
Totally.
So, I mean, we're gonna do a little bit of diagnostics and the issues that we're seeing today. So 2022 happened, now we're in 2025. Obviously, like we have limited time, so we can't go to 100 things, right, that we're seeing. But like, what are some the top observations you have as the biggest issues, threats, considering maybe AI, tech, communities, right, and nonprofit realm?
So I think there's sort of two pieces. One is easier maybe than the other. One is a lack of like computational literacy and digital literate. There's a whole bunch of different names that all get to the same place. Digital literacy, AI literacy, computational literacy, data literacy. Um, I think that both in the general public, right? So a lot of people in just walking around, citizens will say, I get my information about new technologies from science fiction. There's some research to back that up, and there are not sort of trusted channels. And there's a whole other podcast about media and media trust, right? But a lot of people don't have validated channels for getting kind of accurate and informative information, especially once you leave a school setting about like, what do these computational tools do? What's the data that they're based on? And why might we want
Mm.
to expand, right, the lens of people who can participate in that, both the design and the use? And so I think there's a pretty big literacy problem. And then the other problem is maybe a lack of creativity. A lot of my social work colleagues, students, and then practitioners are so in the day to day. Somebody just recently said that they're in doing spaces and not in thinking spaces. And
Mm.
that's sort of sad to say, but that's kind of a luxury item, right? Is the privilege to sort of sit
Wow.
and
Yeah.
think big thoughts and innovation. And so I think that because the work is hard and there's so much need, it's very easy to get caught up in the now and not spend the sort of visioning time to think about how do I make this work better, maybe easier, and also create these spaces where people can be reflective. So I think they're two kind of interrelated problems, but I think the
Yeah,
literacy
yeah, yeah.
problem is really foundational.
Yeah. And the irony about the creativity problem is like technically whatever AI tools are, becoming available should be saving us time on things so we have more time for critical thinking or creativity. But at the same time, if the literacy is not there, then you're never going to get there, right? So it's so tied. And then you really have the time to build that literacy, right? Like, are you catching up or are you doing the work only? Um, and so, I mean, I know, there's a lot of initiatives. Well, actually, not enough initiatives in this space to be able to address this problem, but there's a lot of intent or effort in trying to understand how we go about kind of expediting literacy, right? Or how should we go about literacy in general? So what are your thoughts on that, considering, you know, kind of more like micro interventions that can be done, but also systems interventions that can be done. And then I know like you and I collaborated on one effort together. You can talk a little bit about that too. But yeah, I would love to get your thoughts on, in general, on how to go about addressing this, knowing that there's no one universal pill for everything.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that we're in the process of writing up this like um uh a version of AI governance for the human services. And I think that as I've sort of read a lot of different governance models, it is becoming clear, and this is not an original idea, but it's becoming clear that having sector specific guidelines is really important because each sector,
Mm,
right, sort of has its own opportunities and challenges. And
right.
one thing that I think is actually missing in those governance models is this foundational literacy question. And I think because I think it's really hard to understand what I'm governing if I don't understand what I'm governing.
Yeah.
Um, right? And so I think that that is a maybe a contribution that we can make in this article, but bigger than that is thinking about sort of how do we help people who are in non-classroom based spaces get what they need, maybe in different chunks than a classroom-based lecture, right? To understand these new tools. And so I have been working on or are wrapping up a project called the Competencies Project. And it was originally framed as the inclusive public interest technology learning competencies. And that work was funded by a group called the Public Interest Technology University Network, PIT UN, that was incubated at New America and has now moved out onto it to become its own organization, the PIT UN Network. And the charge of the network, and it is about 45 member universities, both domestic and internationally. The charge of that group is to figure out how to help students engage with public interest technology, broadly construed. So, in my mind, that's like a mechanism to getting to tech literacy, digital
Yeah.
literacy. Um, and we brought together, and this maybe speaks in a long backdoor way into like the idea of cross training. In that working group, these folks who came together over about 16 months, there were engineering professors, HCI, human computer interaction professors, designers, communications scholars, somebody from digital humanities, two lawyers participated from law schools, as well as some industry folks. So both industry folks, primarily from IBM Research, but also a nonprofit person from a tech advocacy group called All Tech is Human, and having, I think, all of the different players or most of the different players at the table thinking about what do we really feel like students need to know in order to go out into the world and govern technology responsibly and say like with safety responsibility and the public in mind. We that ended with the development of these 9 learning competencies, and now Pitt UN is very interested in sort of putting those out in the wild in a range of different contexts. So how do you make a hackathon that is based on public interest technology and that uses or centers um, prioritizing the public interest, right? And so
Mm,
I think that that's a mechanism to start to address how do we sort of get disciplines in the room talking to each other in the
right.
training phase, right? Before people go out in the world and they're on a project team where there's like the project manager who may speak human trying to wrangle the engineers, and then the designers have their own sort of vernacular. What's
Yeah.
the common thread that people can sort of all get on board with when they are starting a project?
I mean, I love this project in many ways. Number one, we kind of to be able even able to talk about like what are the like how does this show up in whatever you do, you kind of need these like framing principles, right, to start the conversation. So it's kind of like the first step of like what might be coming next. But also, I mean, when you look at any problem in the world, right? Like this can be like we could be talking about climate change, we could be talking about like responsible AI. Um, Silos are is one of the underlying reasons of many of the issues we are experiencing today, right? This lack of interdisciplinarity or lack of, professional and lived experience collaboration, right? In many spaces. And what is really interesting, like when you start thinking about it, yes, it's in the corporate realm, in industry, this is as such. But when we go into the education space, it is still like that there, right? So these habits of like working in silos actually start in education. And even if there is an effort within a university or within a program to have these like more interdisciplinary classes or projects, there is not much inter-school, inter-educational institution collaboration happening. And when we're talking about issues this big and complex, if anything, like this shouldn't even like just start in graduate, it should start in undergrad, where we're really trying to bring ourselves together. So, as an educator, would love to get your thoughts on this. Like how, like first of all, what are the reasons and why this is happening in education? Like why are we still in our own silos? And how can we kind of achieve, what are the enablers of achieving this more interdisciplinary, inter-institution collaboration, starting from education? So we start building these habits within the young professionals that are going to come out, and they will have the expectations to do so as they go into the industry. At least this is my hypothesis, but I would love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I th- I think that higher ed is a really complicated, um, under interrogated space with a lot of room for improvement. And so maybe there's like a different conversation about like the crisis in higher ed and trust in public institutions. But I think that the way that universities are structured, and in some ways the way that professional education in particular is structured, makes it hard for faculty to engage in these kind of useful cross-disciplinary conversations. And so by that I mean like you have to look at sort of the bar association's competencies for lawyers, the social work association's competencies for social workers, and ABET is the engineering competencies. And I think that there's sort of multiple pathways for helping to break those barriers down. But we
Mm,
have to kind of understand what those credentialing bodies want, because that is
yeah.
what the administrators and faculty are responding to. And so there's that sort of component, but but so I think that there are faculty that are very, by second nature, sort of are carving out spaces where there are possibilities for interdisciplinary work around things like you mentioned, right? Like climate change, migration, um, tech development to some degree, and and maybe even in the political economy, understanding that there are sort of socio-technical factors, right, that affect how economics unfold.
Yeah,
And so I think like it may be the case that everybody needs a little anthropology in their undergraduate career,
1000%.
right?
Yeah.
And so that, and
Yeah.
maybe everybody needs some qualitative interviewing in their engineering degree so that people can sort of start to build bridges. But you had asked about like, what's the mechanism for, or what's the lever that might make that change? And I think that what's amazing about Pitt UN is that they can be the hammer that makes that happen. And
Mm,
so they are very energized and excited about the competencies, and how they might leverage them into like a second wave of grant making, right? And so
mm,
their leverage point is literally funding. And so, in
yeah.
a climate where there are scarce resources like higher education, one thing that faculty for sure, and to some degree universities tune into, is what is a funder's priorities. And so Pitt UN is very committed to saying, we want these out and used, right? So the only way we're going to
Mm,
know if they're the right competencies is when people start using them, right? And like,
right,
oh,
right.
how do I make my engineering class um, prioritize the value of the public interest. And so I think that that is one lever. And then there are other levers around the folks who are participating, who are also faculty, but participating in the credentialing process. And so
Mm.
I think it might be interesting to think about, and this is an underbaked idea. I haven't really even talked to Pit UN about this, but there are crosswalks into organizations like ACM, the Computer Science Association, or IEEE, the standard setting body. And those committees are often uh, personed or powered by faculty persons. And so having hit
Mm.
faculty and public interest tech champions in those spaces where people are making decisions about
Mm.
like the accreditation level criteria for curricula might be another path into kind of solidifying these foundational ideas and baking them into the accreditation standards.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that is such a good point in terms of like, in the end, one mechanism that enables this is funding. And then if the funding happens in a way where like Pitt UN is doing, right, like making sure you said 45 universities, right, are like members.
Yeah,
So already making kind of this like cross-institution effort as well as cross-disciplinary and motivating again to utilize, this framework in your own way to then, act like an R&D, right? Like we need to prototype and iterate and see how it's most effectively working.
totally.
And how does it show up in higher ed? How does it show up in undergrad? Is there an opportunity for these things in the future to show up in high school, right? Which it
Yeah.
should, right?
Well,
The earlier, the
it
better.
totally should. It totally should. I had spoken to a group that is very interested in K-12, and they were like, "Well, how do we do this in K-12?" The truth is K-12 is much more nimble and agile about adopting new standards than higher
Mm,
ed is, because for they have
mm,
because there's a long history of sort of testing toward using standards and then standards-based assessments. And so I think that K-12 can be
mm,
actually almost easier in some ways. And also the teachers are acculturated to you teach to the standards and there's one set of standards per state. And it's not like on
right.
each institution to kind of figure it out on their own. Um, which gets back to the sort of complicated nature of the university landscape. But I also think there's sort of I think there's kind of like a campaign or like a stakeholder engagement process that has to happen with students to help students
Mm,
understand the value of these cross-training kinds of ideas. And so I was talking to some folks from CUNY maybe last week, and a lot of their students are first in family to go to college. And so whatever that means, New York City, yeah,
mm,
CUNY is an accessible set of institutions that where lots of young people who come from public school go and attend college. And those many of those kids, right? I don't want to make broad generalities, but many of those young people want in the computer science arena want to go to a Google or to finance or to an industry where they will be well
yeah.
equipped to be self-sufficient, right? And to help their families build intergenerational wealth. And my hope is not that only privileged persons can engage with the competencies or public interest technology, but that we're sending out like all of the engineers and all the students out. Like if you go to work at Google,
Mm,
you will have, right? You may not be like a vice president at Google, but when someone is asking you to do something that you know may risk particular populations, you're able to advocate and articulate why that's a bad decision. Right. So it's not just like the public interest
yeah, yeah,
technologist
yeah.
that's going to be the public interest technologist. It's how do we sort of get that level of public interest tech literacy out to like many, many, many students. And I think that it almost is like I think there's something around like a public health campaign kind of strategy to explain why that's important.
Mm, I mean, I think to your point, like starting even like understanding the value of talking to diverse stakeholders, right? Like we see this in tech, we see this in the design world where we come from an educational history where like, oh, the designer knows, or like, oh, I developed this technology, so it's amazing and it's going to be amazing for everyone. The one thing that in tech is the advantage is that you can hopefully not run a global beta version, but run a beta test version and then iterate fast.
Mhm.
Whereas in design, it could be more detrimental. You can release something out into the world and then it's stuck for 150 years. And it's actually, quite exclusive and not working for everybody.
But like
So it,
arguably, let me interrupt for a second.
yeah,
Arguably,
yeah,
like when people put out social media platforms that they knew were spreading disinformation, like they didn't iterate.
yeah,
And so I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that,
yeah. They
that
didn't iterate.
nobody's going to iterate until the public demands iteration.
So true. And hence, like the understanding of really like diverse stakeholders. And even if you don't align on, I don't want to say don't align on values, but maybe if you have different opinions of things, the tool of exposing yourself to different stakeholders and talking to them is already useful in itself that it will open, your brain. And going back to what you said in terms of like if you go to then like a space like Google, it gives you kind of the mechanism like the foundation to be able to advocate and articulate. I think one trap, like in especially for junior roles, they're like, well, I won't have advocacy power, or will I be able to speak up, right? But to your point, there's still huge power in being able to articulate, right? Because now we don't necessarily see this in, I don't see it in the design space that much, where like coming up with like a proper use case or backing your design with like good data,
Mhm.
right? And if anything, like how do we kind of like reframe some of, okay, we're living in a capitalist context, right? So like the deadlines are going to matter, making money is going to matter, but if you understand diverse stakeholders and if you can back it with your research and data and just by having a proper approach in how you're developing something, you could reframe that in a way to your supervisor that would also pique their interest, right? I think like there's huge power in that articulation that I don't know if like young professionals today really like see or have the space or even the tools to be able to do so, right? How do I strategically communicate what I'm working on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so I think that there needs to be, maybe we don't have as many business professors at the table as we might want because there needs to be an ROI on doing the right thing, right? And so
Agreed.
so until the public understands enough or has like the foundational literacy to understand where the harms might lie, then we have to, like, as a sector, right, of the public interest technology field, need to help business understand like what is the ROI on doing the right thing. And I think that
100%.
there's places where listen, this is not a new set of ideas, right? Like there are
Yeah.
fields where we can look and point to where, like, think about sustainable fashion or anti-trafficking in um gosh, labor trafficking, and taking labor trafficking out of fashion, out of other supply chains, and making that transparent. And there are now badges that a business can get that certify that their supply chain is free of trafficked labor. And that's because consumers demanded it. And then legislators, and I'm not suggesting that that technology can, I think that what becomes challenging for that kind of model is that first you have to have a level of technological literacy to understand where the problems are. But talking about, none of these ideas are kind of original, but how do you create a demand where data stewardship becomes a real priority for companies, right? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
going to sell your protected personal identified information off of my mental health platform to Facebook.
Yeah. Like how many of us are reading the agreeing to terms and conditions, you know? Yeah, like let's start awareness around that, right? Just don't like give your life to tech companies. And I think like understanding the implications to your point, like, yes, it is. complex challenge because first you need to build that technological literacy. But at the same time, there could be very easy to digest case examples that could float out there, not necessarily only around AI doomsday scenarios,
Hmm.
right? Because then
Totally.
either we're like putting so much fear and shutting down people. We want people to be critical and demand and understand the potential values and benefits of technology, but they want it responsibly, right? We're also seeing the switch, like to your point, in food, right? Like, why are we more like, why? I mean, yes, like whatever has an organic label doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy anymore, but there is so much more curiosity and demand in quality of food because our level of understanding has grown over the course of years. And also, like things like fashion and food are like common threads in everyone's lives, right? It became
Absolutely.
personable. So because we can relate to it and we utilize it, right? So how do we make technology easy to digest, personable? Everybody's using it anyway. Like how does this show up in your life and what are the risks, right? Like if we can, and tracking the ROI of ethical, accessible, sustainable initiatives, not new either, right? Like it's not baked into the business model, which is why like there are many successful sustainability initiatives that reduce waste, therefore translate into efficiency, but we don't necessarily talk about it in that way because our like even ESG reporting is not geared to be talking about it that way. So to your point, if we could really start translating, and this is like empowering the next gen, right? Like if we could always talk about the ROIs or even like hedging risk, right? Right? Like what are the risks? So create fear or like fear of missing out, FOMO, or fear of, violating a regulation or damaging like a public perspective on something. How do we even like raise those as an awareness? Like, and I think maybe like to your point in terms of like how does this show up in work for young professionals? Maybe like could they like maybe they bring it up in the first project, doesn't really translate, but they keep bringing it up, right? And then at some point it's gonna stick. I think how do we also build that stamina to
Right.
like not give up? And I think in advocacy or activism, like people get like we get into these like emotional realm, which is so hard not to, right? Like very fast. Because it's the obvious, it's the better choice. Like, why aren't we doing this? And which leads into like, oh, I'm not going to work for this company anymore. It's evil. But my fear is that if all people who care leave these companies, we have a higher risk. So how do we provide these tools and education that knowing that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? These are the ways that you could keep bringing it up, and um, how do we also, and I guess this is more like a social work therapy, psychology question, like how do we help people, like young professionals especially, build the stamina um, to continue, like just keeping at it, right? Like just keep showing up in your own way while delivering the work and being business. Well, I know it's a lot to ask too. Like, unfortunately, I wish I could say like, this is not your responsibility. Like the leadership should guide you in the right way. But I'm at this point, I'm like, how do we empower the youth and how do we empower the less empowered mindset?
I think that there's real power in this is a super social working answer. There's
Oh,
real
please.
power
Yeah.
in networks. And so like there are, and this has maybe become more pronounced with the firing of 18F in the recent
Mm,
administrative changes at
yeah.
the federal level. But there have, and maybe this is a great place to utilize social media and social channels and just old school networking, right? Like that
Yeah.
is literally what networking is how do you find people who care about the same things that you care about and then sort of leverage that out in wider and wider circles. But there are groups like there is the tech workers union. There are interesting groups that I think can be leveraged and maybe as kind of external partners or subsidiary partners, other partners to public interest tech uh, to the Pitt UN network. There's the Tech Advocacy Tech, sorry, the Tech Workers Alliance. There's
Mm.
a big group that was doing tech worker whistleblower training, and those folks are sort of out in the world doing the work. And I think that but if folks don't get acculturated to them or know that they exist when they're in
Mm.
their undergraduate days, it becomes kind of hard to disseminate that information. So I think
Mm.
that it's sort of, in my opinion, it's kind of twofold, right? Is like, how do you hold up and celebrate the work that those groups are doing so that regular people know that work is happening? And that's a place where I think foundations could be really helpful, right? They're sort of low, like, if you think about public health campaigns or other like public interest campaigns that have um, in New York City, there's the Ad Council that runs public interest campaigns on a range. It's not just technology, but on a range of different
Mm.
subjects and sort of meeting people where they are, right? Subway campaigns, eye-catching things that give people like little chunks of information, but also celebrating the wins that some of these sort of self-forming advocacy groups have achieved is can be, I think, really a good place to start, right? As well as sort of getting
Yeah,
in
yeah.
on the educational ground level.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's
I
very
don't, yeah,
empowering because
it's
then you're like, oh,
totally
okay, I don't have to be a billionaire to make change.
no,
Like,
but also we
yeah,
have to hold those examples up and use those case examples when people
yeah.
are in school, when we do have like a captive audience.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's such a good point. And I think that's such a like easy to do small intervention for faculty to like just think about that and introduce, like have a
Totally,
guest lecture, introduce the work, right? Share a case study.
totally.
Um, that's a really good point. I mean, I think you sprinkled it throughout, our conversation, but um, something more like wish somebody had told you when you were in college, right? What advice would you give for anyone currently in school or for young professionals trying to, make progress or translate their care into their work? What would be your advice to them?
It's so funny. I don't think of myself necessarily as an optimistic person, but
Mhm.
I do think that kind of not being able to sort of persist and hang on to the possibility that change is possible. That's a lot of possibilities in one sentence, but that I think that that is really important and that it is always going to be a easier road to travel in collaboration and in partnership than it is to fly solo. And I think as a young person, that's really hard to envision because for a whole range of socio-political reasons that the United States privileges. But I do think that it is easier to travel a hard road with fellows than it is to sort of try to, do that hike on your own.
I love that. Find your people, find people, and be hopeful. I think that's such a good advice, right? Like especially when so much is happening, it can be even more paralyzing in a way where you start seeing so much through everything.
Gosh.
So
And yeah,
yeah.
and I guess I would say one more thing, like, and my students kind of, I have said this to most of my students, like change is inevitable. And so I know things feel really, this is sounds so social worky, but I know things are really horrible. Like they are legit horrible right now. But if you wait 10 minutes, something else is going to happen. You just have to hang in there for that 10 minutes, right? Like,
I think like people in even PR must be seeing that they're like clients or crisis management. But this conversation is a proof that we need more social workers in every space that we're in any project, because we kind of need to not only see like the kind of the process that might unfold or understand the human process that might unfold or the human system is taking place, but also what are the tools we can utilize, right? From conversations to collaboration. So thank you, Lauri, for shedding hope into our lives with this conversation. And I look forward to seeing what's next with competencies.
awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so, so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week. See you.